Did Black Lives Matter really advocate for the lives of boys and men? Or was Black Lives Matter really a convenient come-up to more or less impact the functioning of black men in America? In this second expose by Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, Ted Santos, and Brother Arthur McElwain, we're going to continue to explore how all these countercultural groups are coming against black men as they are coalescing to destroy or more or less not advocate for black men as they remain in isolation and as they remain impacted by the ravages of mental health issues. Dr. T. Hasan Johnson is going to explore some of the dynamics of the feminist movement, some black movements, and how all those movements more or less don't really adhere to the functioning and helping black men become sound and functional in this current malaise that we have called America. I want you to sit back, relax, and enjoy this second episode, part 2. And we're going to continue to have the conversation from this remastered classic by Dr. T. Hasan Johnson and myself. And remember this, if it ain't 7, it ain't kosher. If it ain't kosher, it ain't right. There are 7 principles that a man must go through in order to become an optimized male. And family is the key cornerstone to men becoming men. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this show as I'm bringing it to you live from the greatest state in the union. And let's have a conversation or have a conversation with yourself. Be well.
The feminists came in and told our women it was a feminist struggle. It was a gender struggle. It wasn't racial, right? He was saying that the LGBT came in and told our LGBT that it was a sexual struggle. It wasn't racial. You know, you had Marxists, you had student activists coming in saying it was an intellectual struggle. It was a class struggle. It wasn't racial. So all of these different ideologies came in and we literally got picked apart. And when you tried to talk about some kind of blackness, now all of a sudden you had to debate a bunch of people about to what extent that blackness focused on women, what extent it focused on, gays, what extent it focused on this. And all of these different branches began to broaden out and separate our idea of what blackness is. So now, when you hear about a black political agenda, often when you look at the points of it, very little actually speaks to what black men themselves need. Now, we can all agree that there needs to be some change in the incarceration rate of black men. We need to see black men sentenced no differently than any other group for the same crime. And we actually see, of course, black men being hyper sentenced, even above white men for the same crimes. And women actually get 65% less in their sentences for committing the same crimes. And that's across race. So, that's obvious that in a black agenda, you might see something about incarceration, but there are a lot of other parts of the black male experience that nobody wants to talk about that may have an agenda to it. And black men themselves are slowly starting to come together and do it because in the past, we always, we never had to separate ourselves by gender, but because of feminism, we're being forced to. So on my show, The Onyx Report, the last few episodes, we've been actually making a bullet-pointed list, and we're up to about 17 points right now that is particularly targeted to black men. And it's interesting when you see that many points and you think about the issues on it, even if you don't agree with each one, it really gets you thinking about, wait a minute, there's so much that's not been made part of the conversation in regard to a black political agenda that black men really do need to talk about.
So excellent. Who would be endorsing and executing this? Who would it be? Politicians, the business world? Like, who would be taking care of this black agenda?
I think we live in an era now, because I'm probably younger than some of you here. I don't know. You brothers all look, you look like you stopped aging years ago, so I can't tell how old y'all are. But I know I'm old enough to remember my first cell phone call. I'm old enough to remember the first time I heard about an email. I'm old enough to remember the first time somebody told me about the internet. And I'm noticing that in this era, I'm seeing political movements develop off of YouTube to the point where presidential candidates are debating it, when 2 years earlier, it was just a couple of people on YouTube talking about it. So right. I talk about a black male political agenda. At this stage of it, I'm just trying to get brothers to dialogue, brothers to share ideas and list them out. I don't have a pre-prescripted plan on who's going to implement the agenda. All I know is we got to develop it first. And when we develop that agenda, the doorways and opportunities for how it can manifest, that becomes the next step. And that depends on what resources brothers walking in the door and coming into the conversation have. But at this stage of it, I wanted to actually have it written down and put on the screen for people to see, because I hadn't seen that much. And I'm talking about including the academy. I haven't seen a black male political agenda put up in anywhere and discussed openly without apology in terms of what black men themselves need, separate and apart from any other demographic in the community. So I'm not saying, well, we're going to get this candidate in New York and he's going to be the one to push it. I'm not there. All I'm saying is this is the agenda, and I'm looking to see what kind of opportunities open up to take it to the next level. Because understand me, I started my show a year ago. I want to say about June last year. I started on a radio show that I was doing from my house, from this very room, right? A radio show. And now I'm close to 10,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is not a lot. But here's the thing. I have brothers contacting me who run banks. I have brothers who are contacting me in politics. I got brothers contacting me fresh out of prison. You know what I mean? I got brothers who are soldiers on base in Korea reaching out to me. And each of these brothers are telling me their stories from different vantage points. So when you have people in this nexus that are coming from so many different places with so many different backgrounds, opportunities will come about. But you got to start the conversation first. And we got to have a set list of points that we at least are willing to put on the table for dialogue. And I'm not saying that nobody else has done it. I'm just saying I haven't seen it yet.
Right. No, I understand all that. I guess I'm looking at the macro picture, and I'm looking in a sense of how does success happen here in the United States, and you could say around the world, right? So people believe that we live in a democracy, and the whole power to the people. The United States is really a republic, and in a republic, the government serves large landowners,
right,
families,
wealthy, yeah,
and started out as merchants, which are now the large corporations. Mm-hmm. So essentially, those three entities, they created an entity called the government, which was designed to protect their interests anywhere in the world and make their interests easier by building roads and having an army and all that stuff. So the government technically has no power. It's those three entities that write the policies and say, these are the policies we want passed. I mean, you can look at the Kennedys and having their children in politics, and, Rockefellers. So, and one of the things that these three entities, the families, corporations, landowners, they have access and ownership to resources, mineral rights. And that is the conversation that, since I've been a little boy, I haven't really heard black men have that conversation. And to say that, well, it's too hard or impossible to acquire natural resources, that becomes the defeatist mindset. So it is acquiring natural resources so you can actually own an industry and control pricing. So if you have oil wells, there are products that are made from oil. There are other things that you can create aside from drilling the oil, refining it, final products, gas stations. There are lots of other things. And when you own an industry, you don't hand the government your agenda. You hand them policies that were written by lobbyists and say, these are the laws that we want passed. We want these laws and these tax breaks for our company. We want these kind of credits. We want this kind of international trade. And we need some laws passed for the people in our community who work in our organizations. And you're not begging, you're not even asking, you're making demands because they are public servants and they are there to serve you. And if you don't like the way they are serving you, then one of us gets one of our sons or nephews or cousins or nieces to hold an office, and they are there to ensure our agenda is carried out. And that's the conversation that we keep saying the youth is our future. Meanwhile, it's us who's here today creating the future right now. And so we're not creating this future where we are actually taking power. We're not having conversations about power. And that's missing completely.
Well, when you talk about being in a position to implement power and then pushing an agenda, not handing your bullet points to a politician, where we're at in terms of my assessment is we're nowhere near that. We're having the conversation about what the agenda is. I'm not talking about handing it off to politicians. I'm saying, have Black men crafted that agenda? Is it something that we amongst ourselves even understand prior to even getting into a conversation about how to implement it? Do we have it? I haven't seen it on any mass level. So we're at an early stage. But if you really want to deal also with power, you got to deal with economics, because at the end of the day, whether it's resources, whether it's inherited wealth, those things, you're right, in a capitalist system have standing. Now, the reality of the Black community is what it is. I mean, at the end of the day, we're looking at 60% of Black America. 60% of Black America by household prior to taxes earn less than $38,000 a year. Multiple incomes, right? If you start talking about Black men who earn more than $100,000, you're already talking about less than 5% of the population. Right. You could be in the top 3% at over $100,000 a year. You're in the top 3. Do you know what that says about the level of poverty? And all of this is in the last 4 years. Again, we still don't know the data about how COVID, just how much it's impacted our economic standing. Antonio Moore made a point a couple of months ago that I think a lot of people overlooked. He said, we may have lost our professional class by March of this year. The Black professional class, we may have lost it. Not the individual people here or there that still own their businesses, but on a mass level, we may have significantly lost our professional class. And I'm not inclined to disagree with him. So when we have these conversations, one of the things that I think ends up being a resource to us is to look through African-American history. Because whether you're talking about the end of slavery, or whether you're talking about the 60s and the 70s in terms of the civil rights era, one of the things I found is that, and hegemony theory ends up being a very useful concept here, it's not a matter of one group has all the power and a small group of oppressed people have none, and therefore we just got to sit down and shut up until we are multi-billionaires and we can implement policy on a mass level. What tends to happen is that you have an agenda that you and your group maintain, and you exploit opportunities as they present themselves. So when I talk about like the 60s, the civil rights era, again, we've changed that narrative since then, but we drastically, shift what actually happened. We're talking about a bunch of poor folks in the South that nobody gave a damn about. And all of a sudden, we were international news. Well, there's a lot of things there that we overlook and take for granted, just like with the rise of the internet. At that time, you had the rise of a global media. I mean, you were at that, even in the early part of the 20th century, you were starting to see pictures of Africans who were being killed in their own countries by Europeans on magazine covers. And that began to change the political discourse. Well, by the time you get to the 60s, and you're seeing old ladies being hosed down and having dogs sicked on them in the middle of Alabama or Tennessee or Mississippi, that actually changed it. But here's the thing. It didn't change the conversation just because people felt sorry for Black people. It changed the conversation because it was happening during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, the United States was telling the world, we have the culture that everybody needs. We have the best. We can do the best. This is the model that every other country needs to follow. And so the tensions between Russia and the US were starting to heighten. And all of a sudden, these poor Black folk who are now being videotaped became the Achilles heel to America's agenda. If you go back to slavery, it was a similar type of dynamic. They didn't end slavery just because people felt sorry for Black folk. Right. Slavery was a multi-billion-dollar, multi-generational industry where they basically benefited from generations of free labor. They weren't going to stop that unless they were forced to. And the only reason they were forced to is because there was a number of international economic issues at play that pressured the rise of the North over the South. But here's the thing. The North supported slavery too, as long as it was beneficial. But when it came down to a South versus North dynamic, the tensions that these black folk were raising on plantations became a factor. When black folks were burning down plantations and killing slave owners, that added to, in a way, the way the North could use that in a particular. So what I'm saying to you is, it's not that because we don't have any power, nothing can be done. I know that's, and I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but I know that's that's what some people come to. It is that you have to advocate on your own behalf. And when opportunities arise to be exploited, to advance you, you do so. But in order for you to advocate on your own behalf, you still got to have a list of goals, a list of needs, a list of things that you want done. And because we come out of a very distinct type of blackness, black men have not made that kind of list separate from everybody else. And unfortunately, we're at a point in history where we have to. Because again, if you go back the last 5 years, the type of black activism that's making international news has purposely withdrawn us from the discussion.
Right.
To the extent that we die.
And wait, I just want to say something. The end of slavery was not a humanitarian effort. A lot of people don't know that in the 1700s, this white guy wrote a paper that proved that slavery was an unprofitable model. What he did is said, you have to buy a slave, so you have to put out money. You have to provide them with food, shelter, health care. If they get sick, they can't work, and you have to nurse them back to health. If they have a wife and children, you have to provide shelter and food and health care for them also. So you are spending so much money. What it would be smarter to do is to make them free, pay them low wages, and let them be responsible for their food, shelter, healthcare, and all that stuff. And the North embraced it. The only reason the South didn't embrace it is because of representation and taxation and what they would get from Fed funds. So for the South, they wanted slaves to be 3/5 of a person. Otherwise, they had almost no population. So their representation in the government would have hurt them. They didn't keep slavery because it was they understood it wasn't economically profitable. Well, all about politics and representation.
Hold on. It was economically profitable for the South. It definitely was, and it had been for generations. And you're completely right that the debtors model of having those who were formerly enslaved now feed and clothe themselves was definitely more profitable.
Well, that's correct. It's more profitable.
Here's the piece that people overlook, though. When we talk about the shift from the slavery model to the debtors model, one of the things we overlook is part of why it became more cost effective to shift to a new model wasn't just that it wasn't as cost effective, but it was also that these slaves, and this is the part that they kept out of newspapers as often as they could, because they were terrified that enslaved folks in different plantations would hear more and more about it. But the more that you had uprisings, the more that you had work stoppages, the more that you had crop burnings, those things added to the cost. So when you talk about how expensive it was to feed and clothe slaves, yes, that's true. But what they are not saying on top of that is how much more expensive it was for slaves may cut your throat in the middle of the night. You know what I mean? That meant that the cost of slavery was now too expensive. But what you could do in the debtors model, right, by giving the illusion of them having their own land, even though they knew the land wasn't theirs, but they had the feeling that it was, and they could share a crop, and they could go ahead and bring their crops to market every season. The idea was what it guaranteed them was buy-in. So now you didn't have to worry about, these slaves trying to cut your throat in the middle of the night. They believe that they have their own land, their own businesses, and they can participate like, other folks. And that buy-in is what I think really transitioned the discussion for Black folk. But I'm just adding to that. You're right. What's added to the model that a lot of whites kept out of the historical record was how afraid and how costly these uprisings became.
Dr. Johnson, hold, give me 1 minute.
Go ahead.
Dr. Johnson, I want to ask you this because I know you got to go. I want you to talk about Black masculinism and how it differs from the construct of feminism and what it means and what are the implications moving forward. And then after, we're going to talk more about you as you were involved in mass incarceration and all that. And also, I want to add to what Ted and Dr. Johnson is saying. you're right. There is not a universal black agenda because black people are not monolithic. But however, on the meso level and also on the micro level, a lot of men are coming together and saying, listen, we're neither Democrat or Republican. I'm registered as a Democrat, but I'm going to look at policies that are salient to addressing my agenda as a black man, to addressing the agenda for the black family. And the agenda is going to give us some type of visceral power that's going to put us in a position of change. You know, me and Arthur, you know, we talked about it a lot because a lot of people say, oh, you know, people that vote for Trump. Well, I don't care for Trump or I don't care for Biden Harris. I don't care for either of them. But I am going to look at policy. And if their policies are systematically beneficial to me and my community and also me as a human being, then damn it, that's what I'm going to vote for. So I want you to talk about black masculinism.
Well, and that what you just said was incredibly important because again, for us to even have an idea of what is strategically beneficial during every election, again, we need to have a coded list of values, ideas, and goals. And if we don't have it, what we call an agenda, you know, may shift back and forth every year. Like one of the things that's happening right now is a number of black women are using Harris as a kind of Trojan horse to advance a certain type of black female.
Yes, sir. No doubt. I totally agree, brother.
But again, the only people that may even benefit, even if Biden and Harris get elected, is a small collective of black women. It'll be a symbolic victory for a number of black women, but only a small group will actually benefit, which is why we need an agenda that speaks to our needs and black men in particular. But going to your question about black masculinism, just in a nutshell, what it has to do with is a targeted, studied, meditated upon focus on black men outside a stereotype. The reason I developed this focus on black men in both our private lives, our social lives, and even our academic, even the research done on us, which is why I support black male studies, is because what I noticed in the last few decades is that it became commonplace to talk about black men through stereotype. I have been to academic conferences where I've seen panels of PhDs and the subject matter will be on black men and say education, right? And the discussion coming from PhDs on the panel is my nephew, my friend's daughter, my other friend's little cousin. You know, that's the way black males will be discussed in an academic professional setting in certain situations, right? And I'm not saying that across the board for education or black folk in education. What I'm saying is it is acceptable in professional and even academic circles to talk colloquially about black males, and that stands in for any real evidence kind of a measured position. And so what I began to really look at, and I was highly influenced by Dr. Tommy Curry's work and a number of others, Darren Hutchinson, Dr. Ronald Neal, I started to look at how much we avoid the data, you know, the empirical evidence about the lives and conditions of black men. And the more I began to get into the data, the more I found that the stereotypes used in media, in film, and entertainment, and all of that were almost directly contrasted with what the data actually said about black men. I don't care if you're talking about employment. I don't care if you're talking about incarceration. I don't care if you're talking about intimate partner violence or homicide. And almost every metric I could find on every issue I could find, when we looked at the data, black men's lives went against stereotype in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And so when I began to develop black masculinism, it was with the goal of getting us, and most particularly black men, to actually meditate on their own experiences in relation to what the data and what the historical research is telling us about black male lives, rather than the stereotypes people were comfortable with giving for black men. And so when I began to do that, it changed the discussion. And
I think that shows a lot. You know, Ted has done a great job on the show Straight Talk, and Arthur has done a great job on Tell the Truth. But we talk about seminal issues. You know, one of the more or less correlating things that I've heard, we always say that, you know, they always look at the percentage of black men that impregnate our women, and they say, well, black men ain't, we impregnate our women, we leave them. But study says, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that only 51% of black men have children. And black men are actually excellent in taking care of their kids. But the narrative, like you say, is contraindicated as it relates to the empirical data. because the empirical data suggests that we're doing actually better than the prolific stereotype that we're seeing in the community. So I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense.
Well, when you don't control for incarceration, black men actually do make a good income, relatively speaking. Again, pre-COVID, we don't know what it is since then. I'm still waiting for that data. But when you control for incarceration, we actually make 51 cents on every dollar white men make. We make, and that, black women make about 63 cents on every white male dollar. And then, of course, white women make about 75. So black men are actually at the bottom when you look at the impact of incarceration, which again was not accidental. But I think what's important for us to look at too is really when you talk about fatherhood or the percentage of black men, when you factor in how many black men have children, but also how many are married, there's only about 18% or so of black men that are contributing to the common stereotypes about black men as fathers, right? We just impregnate a bunch of women and we disappear. But when you look at the data, it's only about 18% of black men that are doing that. So You're talking about women who are often employed and sometimes even six-figure women who will often opt for men in that 18% that have a track record of children with multiple people and so on and so forth. It's a very small percentage of black men actually doing that. But again, that's why I wanted to push for data over stereotype, because the world is comfortable with that particular image of us. And we often buy it because we see it coming from so many different sources, from media to family members. I mean, black men will reach out to me and tell me about going to their Thanksgiving or family reunion and listening to the women get together and almost rehearse the same stereotypes about black men in a kind of finger-wagging, shaming fashion. But after listening to shows like this or shows like mine, where they're introduced to the data, they actually are able to go back and actually say something that challenges these popular stereotypes. And what they started to notice was that the response was silence.
Right.
And that became a very redeeming kind of moment for many black men who are starting to understand, wait a minute, this stereotypical agenda that's been advanced often by black feminist methods, it's an illusion. It's not real. And when you push back against it with hard data or historical narrative, all of a sudden you find out that it's smoke and mirrors. So now we can get to the core of the issue and really talk about what black men are doing.
Address your point about mass incarceration. I know Dr. Johnson got to go in a few minutes, but address your point about mass incarceration, the impact that you think it had on you and your family and the community. I want you to talk about that, and then also the current political trends as it relates to mass incarceration.
Most definitely, and that's one of the reasons I started trying to tell the truth. I felt like nobody wanted to really actually tell the truth, as the doctor was saying about the trends and the numbers. And I'm gonna get to that in just a second, but I'm gonna just.
Well, I think he froze.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you. He froze.
Okay. Well, until Arthur come back in, Ted, I want you to highlight what Dr. Johnson said. I want to segue some of the information that you've shared on your show until Arthur gets back.
So, I'm all for the 17 points. At the same time, if you don't start creating black economic power, there's nowhere to go, because when you own an industry, you can create jobs for your community. And that is really the problem. This is all economics. And so when you own an industry, it's like if you drill oil, you have iron ore well, whatever the natural resource is, you create thousands of jobs. If we just took us four, if I drilled the oil, Smalls did the refinery, and Hasan, if you opened gas stations or you sold other products that are made, oil, they're made from oil. That is, we're three people in one vertical industry, which can expand beyond that. But that is where I call one of you guys and says, hey, my nephew has a degree in such and such. Can he work in your company? We don't have that power. But the thing is, the pieces of the puzzle are there. There are men and women in the black community who do have the wherewithal financially. They have the capital. You have people with degrees in engineering, you and all these others We are not coming together, even with our athletes that are making a lot of money. We praise people for building schools instead of owning an industry. That we're not having the conversation, and that's what I'm really getting at. The conversation doesn't exist, and we're hoping someone is going to save us. And if we don't become the master of our destiny, because whether it's the Chinese or the Middle Easterns who come here, they come here and work together. And I'm not saying crabs in a barrel. I'm saying there's psychological warfare, like you were laying out. There are statistics of what's happening with Black men, and then there's the media that paints another picture. They can do that just like they've painted pictures about Asians and Middle Easterns, yet they still come together and create their economic prosperity. And if you look at the Black community in the 50s and 60s, you actually had more economic prosperity back then than you do today. You had more Black-owned businesses, not some what do you call that? A professional company where you're just a one-man shop. Well, we abandoned that.
Let me respond, brother, because I do have to go, and I really want to thank you, all three of you actually, for a great conversation. I'm really, I'm sad I didn't get to hear more from Arthur. It sounded like some technical issues that hit him a few different times. But let me say, so a couple things that come to mind in response. First, let me say I agree. We're not going to disagree on that. The need for Black economics is as strong as it ever was, and maybe even be stronger now. I completely agree. What I will say, however, is that there's a couple things. You mentioned, the percentages of us who own businesses and to what our condition is. Over 90% of Black businesses have one employee. 99% of Black women's businesses have one employee. That is a reality of where we are right now. Right. But I would also add, in as much that as we've enjoyed different status, especially prior to integration, I agree with you. One of the things we do have to take into account is there's nothing new under the sun. Black folk did not fail at this because of lack of imagination or lack of effort. We have tried everything. And whether you're talking about at the middle level where policy was used to prevent us from participating and competing, or the most extreme situation when you look at the Tulsa, Oklahomas, right? Tulsa was the first city in world history to be bombed from the air. And all it was Black folk who were doing well. And there were over 500 mass town burnings of Black folk who were starting to do well. I mean, so when we look at why we haven't seen the advancement of Black economics over the last 2 centuries, it hasn't been because we haven't tried or because we lack the imagination or the effort. It has been both systemic and terroristic in its most extreme to prevent that from happening. This is one of the reasons the war on drugs was so important and necessary in terms of undermining Black men, because it began to serve as a long-term check in many ways against that very type of advancement. So I'm agreeing with you, but I'm also saying that whatever strategy we develop has to take into account that it's not that we haven't tried. That's the issue. It's that we often underestimate how purposeful the state has been in denying our advancement, and that needs to become part of the strategy. That's why we're in 2020 having conversations that we could have had and we did have in the 1950s and 60s. If you listen to those Malcolm X lectures and Elijah Muhammad, you can go back to Marcus Garvey. These are the same conversations. Booker T. Washington, it's the same conversations. But again, I just want to add, it's not because we just are inherently lazy or unintelligent. There has been a strategic, methodical, systemic push for decades, for generations, to prevent that from happening. And I just think we need to keep that in mind and make that a part of how we strategize, because it hasn't gone anywhere.
So, and you're right. So Oklahoma, as you were saying, wasn't the only one. Wilmington, South Carolina, there were a lot of.
No, it's Wilmington, North Carolina, and Durham.
I'm sorry.
Represent. Tar Heel State.
North Carolina on the stick.
I'm gonna fire you, Ted. I'm about to cut you off. You're about to represent.
So, but there's everything you say is on the money, but I just question whether there's a conversation that Black people don't want to have, and I'm talking about global Black people. There's a conversation around power and quitting that Black people don't want to have. And I'll give you an example. I think Black people have quit more than we want to discuss. And yes, they did do those things in Oklahoma and other, no question they happened. But there's also strategically, there was nothing, no structure in place to support that happening, right? So if you look at sports in the United States, Black people, especially Black men, were told they were not smart enough. They didn't have the athletic ability. However, through slavery, they mixed the strongest with men and women, which created superior athletes. Yet they told them they couldn't play. So what did Black men do? They created Negro leagues for baseball, basketball, football. And technically, they were better than the white leagues. And the 1940s, 2 years in a row, the best white NBA team played the best Black team, and the Black team won 2 years in a row. So they had to start hiring them. I think they quit on themselves because we have no Negro leagues or teams left. Now, contrast that with, look at the Jews who were denied access to professional jobs. Take the white shoe law firms. White shoe law firms would not hire Jewish attorneys at all. They despised them. So what did Jews do? They did like Blacks did. They created their own law firms. And because they were looked down on, they practiced law that the prestigious white shoe firms didn't want. Divorce law, personal injury, and M&As, mergers and acquisitions. No one cared about mergers and acquisitions. In fact, it cannibalized the business of the prestigious firms. So in 1970s, the prestigious firms started looking at M&As. And they saw a huge money-making opportunity to expand their services. And what did they do? Well, they ended up hiring a Jewish guy because they had thousands of hours of experience doing M&As, and the prestigious white firms couldn't compete with them. The Jews knew all the loopholes and where the strengths and weaknesses of doing a deal was. So they started hiring Jews. Now everyone thinks having a Jewish lawyer is better. It's only that instead of them selling out their law firms to jump ship and work with the prestigious, they kept their firms. Now everyone wants to work for a Jewish law firm. I think it's better. I think that was the opportunity for the Black community with sports. They could have created a vertical industry, from the teams to building stadiums and seats and food. There are lots of things that could have come out of that, but we have it even with churches. We are just not economically coming together. And if you want to look at slavery, how slaves were sold and given up to Europeans, like there's something that we're doing that has us almost short circuit and not play ball when the colonists show up. And we acquiesce, almost like we think what they have is better than what we have.
I apologize. I really have to go, but I think we lost our host. So I think he's going to have to come back in. And what's probably going to need to happen is y'all might have to. Huh?
We all disconnect. Maybe he's still there. I see.
No, this has happened to me on StreamYard before.
Oh, no kidding. Okay.
He's either going to have to come back in, or I don't know if he's trying to set up a whole new show. I hope he just comes back in. But y'all might actually have to hold his show. There he goes.
There he is.
I had to use the bathroom, man. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I didn't know.
I apologize.
Because I've actually been bumped off before in my own show, and my guests
Right.
had to hold it for me. But
Right,
I do have to go. I just wanted to really quickly say one of the biggest issues that has instrumentally been used against us since slavery has been the prevention from being able to amass any kind of wealth, because the overwhelming majority of wealth in this country is inherited. In terms of families and individuals, it's inherited wealth.
Right.
We've not been able to develop that. And in terms of what you mentioned, in terms of a global response, brother, I mean, whether you're talking about, Fred Hampton in Chicago, whether you're talking about Patrice Lumumba, whether you're talking about Malcolm Martin, it wasn't that we lacked that idea. It was that, look at the extent they went. Each of the people I named was assassinated to prevent it from happening. These are not accidental occurrences. And you talk about the Jews and what they were able to do. There's no other group that has our history. I mean, and at the end of the day, the Jews even have Israel. I mean, they have a country. You know what I'm saying? These are not purely kind of incidental things. When you talk about the Negro Leagues and the rise of the Negro, one of the biggest problems the Negro Leagues had is a lack of capital in terms of actually being able to maintain, especially in competition with, and they were able to build that up to a particular extent. They definitely had the talent, but at the end of the day, they didn't have the infrastructure or the means to advance it the way we saw with these white leagues and so on and so forth. So, and you can say the same thing about a number of different industries. We can talk about the black hair care industry and how they were all bought out in the 1980s. At the end of the day, we only had so much capital and it was difficult to compete. But I'm simply saying that when we have these discussions, we definitely need to be sensitive to the lack of capital, the impact of that, and the strategic use of it to prevent us from being able to compete in ways that others have, especially when you're talking about a group that doesn't have international support, that doesn't have any we have no alliances of worth, you know what I mean, that's been able to substantiate our position in regard to capital, which has been one of our major Achilles heels, but it's not an accidental heel. It's been a very purposeful one, and it's been maintained. And I agree with what you said earlier. It's actually gotten worse since the 1960s. I think our standing is worse than it was then. But I do have to go, brother, so I apologize.
I assert we have access to capital. We're just not creatively putting the pieces of the puzzle together.
Right, exactly.
And I think the problem is our intention. There's tons of. I understand there are so many people who make less than a certain amount, but there is. Look, the black community spends like $1.1 trillion.
Which when you compare to other groups, is nothing.
I understand, but if you don't start with some industry, if you don't start capitalizing.
But here, when you talk about the $1 trillion, you do realize that the overwhelming majority of that is spent on necessities, right? And I know the stereotype is that we're spending it on Nike shoes and all that. No, the overwhelming majority of what we spend is actually on daily necessities. So again, I'm not saying that there aren't opportunities that we can take advantage of. I'm all for that. Right. But at the end of the day, if we start this analysis with this deficit idea that black folk just lack intelligence, we're lazy, if that's the basis of our analysis, we've already begun on the wrong foot.
I think you both guys
historically.
I think you guys both are saying the same thing in different ways. And here's what I'm saying. I know you got to go, Dr. Johnson. I agree with you if you look at it from a macro level as it relates to raw numbers. But I think what Ted is talking about is group economics. And even though there might be a small amount, if you get people to work together using group economics, say Ted come with $10,000.
Wait, but I'm not opposed to group economics. That's not what I'm saying. I'm all for it. Yeah. I'm saying, however, if you start this discussion with the assumption that black folk haven't tried hard enough, we haven't been smart enough. If you're already at a position where you're actually disavowing generations of history that proves the opposite. I mean, but again, I'm not trying to stand in the way of us enterprising. Let's do it. But I also again, going back to black masculinism, I do want us to start from a reality of where we are, because prior to the last 20 years, when I would hear black people have these conversations, we would start with these kind of Cosby Show approaches, which belied the actual reality of our economic position by giving us the idea that because many of us went to college, the reality of the Cosby Show is something we all had and we just weren't, innovative enough. But what we actually found out was over 40% of the black community lives off of less than $21,000 a year. So when you have to deal with the reality as a starting point, I think be it historically or economically, it helps us to actually strategize more effectively. But if we take this idea that we just spend trillions of dollars a year and we're wasting it, I think it doesn't give us a realistic picture of where we're starting from, and it hampers whatever strategy we develop because it's based on a deficit model. But anyway, I apologize, fellas. I do have to go.
Okay, well, listen.
Well, and thank you for having me on.
I want to have you back again, brother. We got to finish this conversation, especially the piece about defection due to affection. So,
oh man, I really wanted to get to that too.
Well, we'll get to it, brother. But it was a pleasure. I'm grateful for your opportunity, and we're gonna finish this show. But I'll see you on the next session. Thank you, brother.
You guys take care. Good to meet you both.
No doubt. All right, off. Faith is before you. Choose wisely.